The airport was loud that morning, the kind of loud that made people impatient without even knowing why. Rolling suitcases bumped into chairs. Phones rang. Boarding announcements echoed through the air. People rushed past each other with tired faces and coffee cups in their hands. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry. He was not. He stood near the gate with his young son beside him, holding a small backpack that looked almost too big for his thin shoulders. The father's jacket was clean but old. The edges of the sleeves were slightly worn. His shoes had been polished carefully, even though they had clearly seen many years. He did not look like the other travelers in pressed suits or expensive sneakers. He looked simple, quiet, easy to overlook. His boarding pass read Seat 12F. His son looked up at him with bright eyes. "Are we really going on a plane?" the boy asked softly, as if he was afraid the answer might change. The father gave a small smile. "Yes, window seat, just like I promised." The boy grinned and hugged his backpack tighter. When boarding began, passengers lined up quickly. Some pushed forward, some sighed loudly. The father waited until the line grew shorter before stepping forward. He did not like to block anyone or cause delays. He handed his ticket to the agent with steady hands. The agent barely looked at him. A quick scan, a nod. Next. He didn't mind. He was used to that tone. He was used to being just another face in the crowd. Inside the plane, the air felt different. Cooler, controlled, quiet in a strange way. Flight attendants greeted passengers with polite smiles that looked practiced and tired at the same time. When he stepped in with his son, one attendant gave a short nod, but quickly turned her attention to a well-dressed couple behind them. They walked slowly down the aisle, counting the seat numbers. 10, 11, 12. "Here we are," he said gently. Seat 12F was by the window. The boy slid in carefully, pressing his face against the glass, even though there was not much to see yet. The father took the seat beside him. He placed their small carry-on bag under the seat and helped his son buckle up. Around them, other passengers settled in. A businessman in 12D glanced at the father's jacket and then looked away. A woman across the aisle adjusted her designer handbag so it would not touch his arm. No one said anything rude. No one needed to. The silence said enough. He noticed it, but he didn't react. He had learned long ago that silence was easier than confrontation. The boy kept talking softly about how high the plane would fly, how small the houses would look from the sky. The father listened carefully, nodding, answering every question like it was important. To him, it was. As the plane began to fill up, a flight attendant walked down the aisle checking seat belts. When she reached their row, she paused for a brief second. Her eyes moved from the father's worn jacket to his son's old sneakers. Something unreadable passed across her face, but it disappeared quickly. "Seatbelts fastened?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," the father replied politely. She gave a quick nod and continued walking. The plane doors closed. The engines hummed to life, low and powerful. The boy's eyes widened. "Dad," he whispered, gripping his father's hand. "I've got you," the father said calmly. He always said that. "I've got you," even on days when he wasn't sure how he would pay rent. Even on nights when he skipped meals so his son wouldn't notice the fridge getting empty. Even when life felt heavier than he ever expected it to be. The plane began to move, slowly at first. The cabin shook gently as it reached the runway. Conversations faded. The businessman beside them put on noise-canceling headphones. The woman across the aisle closed her eyes. The engines roared louder. The boy squeezed his father's hand tighter as the plane rushed forward and lifted into the sky. For a brief moment, everything felt weightless. The boy gasped, "We're flying!" The father looked out the window with him. The ground below grew smaller. Roads turned into thin lines. Buildings became tiny shapes. He had not been on a plane in years. Not since a different time. A different life. Back then, flying had been routine. Normal. Necessary. Now, it felt almost unreal. As the plane leveled out, the seat belt sign remained on. The cabin relaxed. Soft chatter returned. A baby cried somewhere in the back. A flight attendant pushed a cart down the aisle, offering drinks. When she reached row 12, she smiled at the businessman first. Something to drink, sir? Sparkling water, he said, without removing his headphones. She handed it to him carefully. Then she turned to the father. Her smile softened but became more formal. And for you? Just water, please, he replied. And for him? She asked, looking at the boy. The boy hesitated, glancing at his dad. Water is fine, the father said gently. The attendant handed them 2 small cups. The boy accepted his with both hands like it was something special. Thank you, the father said. She nodded and moved on. The businessman opened a snack he had brought from the lounge. The smell drifted across the row. The boy noticed but didn't say anything. He stared out the window again instead. The father noticed that too. He leaned closer and whispered, "When we land, we'll get your favorite sandwich." The boy's face lit up. Really? Really? It wasn't a big promise, but it mattered. As the flight continued, most passengers lost interest in each other. Laptops opened. Movies played on seat screens. People disappeared into their own worlds. But a few quiet glances still found their way towards seat 12F. A man walked past to use the restroom and looked twice at the father, as if trying to place him. Then he shook his head and kept walking. The father remained calm, unaware, or perhaps simply uninterested in the attention. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to think. This trip meant something. It wasn't a vacation. It wasn't luxury. It was tied to a memory he carried quietly, a promise he had made long ago, a promise he intended to keep. His son leaned against him, small and warm, trusting. He opened his eyes and looked down at the boy's hair, slightly messy from the rush to the airport. He gently smoothed it with his hand. People often saw the outside first. The old jacket, the simple bag, the tired eyes. They did not see the long nights he had worked. They did not see the sacrifices made quietly. They did not see the strength it took to raise a child alone, without asking for help. To most of the cabin, he was just another struggling father trying to get by. Seat 12F. Nothing special. The plane continued through clear skies. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow across the cabin. The boy eventually grew quiet, watching clouds drift by like giant fields of white cotton. The father stared out too, but his mind was somewhere else. He remembered another time he had looked down at clouds from above, back when his life had followed a different path, back when people did not look past him. He did not miss the attention. He did not miss the noise. But sometimes he missed a sense of belonging. A small announcement came over the intercom from the cockpit, routine and calm. Most passengers barely listened. The father's eyes flickered for a brief second at the sound of pilots' voices. Just for a moment, then his expression returned to normal. The businessman beside him shifted slightly, glancing again at the quiet man in the worn jacket. There was something steady about him, something disciplined in the way he sat, back straight, movements controlled, eyes alert even when relaxed. But the thought passed quickly. Assumptions are easier than curiosity. The boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad." "Yes." "Are you happy?" The question came out of nowhere. The father looked at him, surprised. He thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said honestly. "I am." And in that moment, he meant it. He did not need first-class seats. He did not need expensive clothes. He did not need anyone's approval. He had his son beside him. He was keeping a promise. He was moving forward. The rest did not matter. Around them, the plane moved steadily through the sky, filled with strangers who believed they understood the man in seat 12F just by looking at him. They had no idea who he really was. And they were about to find out. The plane moved smoothly through the sky, but his mind was far from calm. As his son rested against his arm, watching clouds, he found himself drifting back to years that changed everything. There was a time when his life looked very different. He had once lived in base housing surrounded by other families who understood long hours and sudden goodbyes. Mornings had started early, boots by the door, uniform pressed with care. His wife used to stand in the kitchen doorway holding a cup of coffee, pretending she wasn't worried every time he left. She used to smile and say, "Come back safe." He always answered the same way. "I will." For a long time he did. Back then, flying had been normal. not as a passenger, but as part of something bigger. The sound of jet engines wasn't exciting. It was work, responsibility, focus. He carried a call sign that meant something in certain circles. It wasn't a nickname chosen for fun. It was earned through discipline, training, and trust. But that life came with weight. Long absences, missed birthdays, missed school plays, apologies whispered over video calls with weak connections. He told himself it was worth it. He was building a future, protecting something larger than himself, providing stability. Then one year, everything shifted. His wife fell sick. At first, it seemed small. Fatigue, headaches. Doctors said stress. They both believed it. Life was stressful. That was normal. But weeks turned into months, and the hospital visits became more serious. He remembered sitting in a quiet hospital hallway late at night, staring at the floor while machines beat behind a curtain. He had faced high-pressure missions without fear, yet sitting there, waiting for a doctor to speak, felt harder than anything he had done before. When the diagnosis came, it changed the air in the room. The future they had planned suddenly felt uncertain. He tried to stay strong. He balanced hospital visits with duty. He told no one how scared he was. He smiled for his child, who was still too young to understand why Mom was always tired. But sometimes strength is not enough. The day he lost her was silent. Too silent. The hospital room felt colder than it should have. He held her hand and promised he would take care of their son. He promised he would make sure the boy grew up knowing how much she loved him. After that, the uniform felt heavier. He returned to work for a while. Routine helped. Structure helped. But something inside him had changed. Every time he prepared for another assignment, he looked at his son sleeping and felt a sharp pull in his chest. One evening, after putting the boy to bed, he sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty. He looked at the small drawing taped to the fridge. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. The boy had drawn it before his mother got sick. He realized then that his son had already lost one parent. He could not risk losing another. That was the night he made the hardest decision of his life. He stepped away from the career he had built for years. People respected him for his service. Some did not understand why he would leave. A few quietly questioned his choice. But none of them were standing in that kitchen. None of them were listening to a child cry for his mother in the middle of the night. So he left. Civilian life was not easy. The transition came with paperwork, job searches, and long days of uncertainty. His savings helped for a while, but not forever. The jobs he found at first did not match his experience. Employers saw a resume filled with service, but did not always know how to place it. He worked security for a time, then warehouse shifts, then maintenance work. None of it was glamorous. None of it paid what he once earned. But each paycheck kept the lights on. Money became tight. He learned how to stretch every dollar. He stopped buying new clothes. He repaired old ones instead. He cooked simple meals at home. He told his son that homemade food was better anyway. Birthdays became smaller, fewer gifts, more handmade cards. But there was one thing he never reduced, his time. He walked his son to school every morning when he could. He attended parent meetings, even when he came straight from night shifts, tired but determined. He learned how to pack lunches properly. He learned how to braid hair when needed for school events. He learned patience in ways no training had ever taught him. Some nights, after his son fell asleep, he would sit alone and feel the weight of everything pressing down at once. Bills stacked on the table. Unanswered emails about job applications. Quiet memories of the life he once had. He never allowed himself to break in front of his child. There were moments when people underestimated him. When neighbors assumed he couldn't handle parenting alone. When teachers gently asked if there was another guardian who could attend meetings. He would simply smile and say, "It's just us." And somehow they made it work. The trip they were on now was not random. A few weeks earlier, he had received a letter. It was formal, respectful, an invitation connected to his past service, a small recognition event tied to a group he once belonged to. It wasn't publicized. It wasn't flashy. Just a quiet gathering of people who understood. At first, he almost declined. Travel cost money. Taking days off work meant lost wages. But the letter mentioned that families were welcome. He looked at his son sitting at the table, struggling with homework. The boy had recently asked questions about his father's old photographs, the one stored carefully in a box in the closet. "Were you really up in the sky?" the boy had asked. "Yes." "Were you scared?" "Sometimes." "Why did you do it?" He had paused before answering. Because it mattered. That conversation stayed with him. He realized his son deserved to see that part of his life. Not for pride, not for applause, but to understand that his father had once stood for something bigger and had chosen him when it mattered most. So he booked the tickets. Economy class, seat 12F. He didn't tell many people about the trip. There was no need. To most of the world, he was just a single dad working hard and keeping quiet. On the plane, as his son pointed excitedly at the clouds, he felt a mix of emotions. He wondered if the people around him would ever guess who he used to be. He doubted it. Time had changed him. The sharp edges of military life had softened into something quieter. But discipline never truly leaves a person. It shows in small ways. The way he observed exits when boarding. The way he instinctively noted the safety briefing without looking distracted. The way he remained calm during turbulence. The businessman beside him shifted again, glancing at his posture. There was something steady about him, something composed. But appearances are powerful things. Worn jackets often speak louder than quiet confidence. His son leaned into him again. "Dad, when we land, will there be other planes?" "Yes," he said. "Big ones. Very big ones." The boy smiled with excitement. He looked down at his child and felt a quiet sense of pride. Not for what he had done in the past, but for what he had endured since. Raising a child alone had tested him in ways nothing else ever had. There were no medals for bedtime stories, no ceremonies for packing lunches, no recognition for staying patient during tantrums after long shifts. But this was the mission that mattered most. He adjusted slightly in his seat and looked out at the sky again. Somewhere ahead of them was a reminder of the life he once lived. But right beside him was the reason he had walked away from it. He did not regret his choice. He only hoped that one day, when his son was old enough to understand, he would see that every sacrifice had been made out of love. The plane continued forward, carrying a man many had already judged, and a child who believed his father could do anything. Neither of them knew that before this flight ended, the past he kept so quiet would rise into the present in a way no one on board expected. The flight had settled into its rhythm. Seatbelt signs were off. Lights were dimmed slightly. The hum of the engines became a steady background sound that most passengers stopped noticing. People watched movies, scrolled on phones, or slept with neck pillows tilted at awkward angles. In the cockpit, it was business as usual. The two pilots monitored instruments, checked their route, and kept an ear on routine radio traffic. Their voices were calm, professional, almost casual. This was the part of the job that felt smooth, predictable, until one small detail changed the tone. A routine communication came through the radio. Clear, brief, nothing unusual at first. But within the exchange, a call sign was mentioned. Just a few words. A sequence of letters and numbers most passengers would never hear, let alone understand. The first pilot paused. "Say that again?" he asked quietly, not into the radio, but to the other pilot. The second pilot looked up from the panel. "You heard it too?" They exchanged a look. The kind of look that doesn't need words. They listened again as the information was repeated. The call sign matched a name in their memories. Not a famous one, not one known to the public, but one that carried weight among those who had trained in the same skies, followed the same strict standards, and trusted their lives to people beside them. The first pilot leaned back slightly. That can't be a coincidence. The second pilot shook his head slowly. If it's him, he's on this flight. There was a brief silence in the cockpit. Not confusion. Recognition. They both knew what that call sign meant. It wasn't something you forgot. It belonged to someone who had flown with discipline, who had earned respect the hard way. Someone known not for loud words, but for calm decisions when pressure was highest. "Passenger list," the first pilot said. The The second pilot pulled it up, scanning names and seat numbers. His finger stopped. "There," he said. "Seat 12F. The cockpit went quiet again. Economy class. Window seat. The second pilot let out a slow breath. "I never thought I'd see that call sign on a passenger list." "Neither did I," the first replied. "Especially not like this." Down in the cabin, nothing felt different. The father in seat 12F was helping his son with a puzzle game on a small tablet. He pointed at the screen patiently, letting the boy figure things out on his own. He smiled when the boy succeeded, clapping softly so as not to disturb others. Around them, people were still wrapped in their own worlds. The businessman beside him typed an email, frowning slightly at the screen. The woman across the aisle adjusted her blanket. A flight attendant passed by with a quiet smile, checking overhead bins. No one noticed a shift happening above them. Back in the cockpit, the pilot spoke in low voices. "He left early," the second pilot said. "I remember when word went around." "Yeah," the first said. "No big send-off. Just gone." "People said family," the second added. The first pilot nodded. "That fits." They both understood what that meant. Many didn't make that choice. Walking away was harder than staying, in its own way. For a moment, they debated silently. There were rules, protocols, boundaries. Pilots didn't single out passengers. Flights ran on procedures, not emotions. But this wasn't about attention. It was about respect. The first pilot adjusted his headset slightly. "I think we should acknowledge it." The second pilot hesitated. Quietly. "Of course." They agreed without another word. In the cabin, the father felt a slight change in the air, though he couldn't explain why. Years of experience had trained him to notice small shifts, tone changes, pauses, patterns breaking. He glanced toward the front of the plane for a second, then returned his attention to his son. "You okay?" the boy asked. "Yes," he said. "Just listening." "To what?" He smiled. "Everything." A few minutes later, the familiar sound of the intercom clicked on. Most passengers barely reacted. They expected another routine update about weather or arrival time. The captain's voice came through, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. We're currently cruising smoothly and expect to arrive on time. The weather ahead looks clear." People returned to their screens. Then the voice continued, just slightly slower now. "We also want to take a moment to recognize someone on board today." That caught attention. Heads lifted. Screens paused. A quiet ripple of curiosity moved through the cabin. "In seat 12F, the captain said, there's a passenger traveling with his child who once carried a call sign that many of us in the air respect deeply." The father felt his chest tighten. He looked down at his son, who was staring up at him, confused. The cabin grew very quiet. The businessman beside him slowly removed his headphones. The captain continued, his voice still controlled, but warmer now. "Some service doesn't come with medals you can see. Some sacrifices are made quietly, long after the uniform is gone." The father's hands rested flat on his knees. He didn't move. He didn't look around. He wished briefly that the moment would pass. But it didn't. To the individual in C-12F, the captain said, "Thank you for what you've done, and for who you continue to be." Then the intercom clicked off. For a second, no one spoke. Then something unexpected happened. The first officer stood up from his seat in the cockpit doorway. He didn't say anything. He simply placed his hand over his heart and gave a small, respectful salute toward the cabin. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was clear. A few seconds later, the captain did the same, visible through the open door. The cabin reacted in waves. Gasps, whispers, people turning in their seats to see who was in 12F. The father finally looked up. Dozens of eyes were on him. He felt exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. Slowly, he stood, careful not to bump his son's head. He didn't return the salute in a formal way. He simply nodded once, deeply. His face was calm, but his eyes were wet. The boy looked around, wide-eyed. "Dad!" The father knelt slightly to meet his gaze. "It's okay," he whispered. Applause began softly, then spread. Not the loud, excited kind. Something slower, respectful. Some passengers clapped. Others didn't, but watched with new expressions. Shock, confusion, guilt, admiration. The businessman beside him stared, speechless. The woman across the aisle covered her mouth. A flight attendant stood frozen near the galley, her eyes locked on the quiet man she had barely noticed earlier. The father raised one hand gently, signaling for the clapping to stop. It faded. He sat back down. His heart was racing, but his posture remained steady. Years of control didn't disappear easily. The boy tugged at his sleeve. Why did they do that? He thought carefully before answering. Because sometimes people remember things. Were you scared? The boy asked. The father smiled softly. A little. Were you brave? He paused, then said, I tried to be. The plane returned slowly to normal. Conversations resumed, but they were different now. Softer, more thoughtful. People glanced toward seat 12F with new eyes. Not curiosity anymore. Understanding. In the cockpit, the pilots returned to their instruments. That felt right, the second pilot said quietly. The first nodded. Some things deserved to be acknowledged. Below them, at 30,000 feet, a man who had spent years being invisible sat quietly with his child, the past finally catching up to the present, not with noise, but with respect. And for the first time in a long while, the people around him saw more than a worn jacket and an economy seat. They saw the weight of a life lived with purpose. For several seconds after the salute, the cabin felt suspended in time, not because of turbulence, not because of fear, because something quiet and powerful had just happened, and no one quite knew how to return to normal. The father remained seated in 12F, his hands resting calmly on his legs. His son kept looking up at him with wide eyes, trying to understand why the entire plane had suddenly focused on his dad. The businessman beside him cleared his throat awkwardly. He removed his headphones fully now and turned slightly. I had no idea, he said quietly. The father gave a small nod. That's okay. Across the aisle, the woman who had earlier pulled her handbag away leaned forward slightly. Thank you, she said softly. He didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded again. The applause had faded, but the air had changed. The quiet judgments from earlier were gone. In their place was something heavier. Reflection. A flight attendant approached slowly. The same one who had handed him water without much thought earlier. Her voice was gentle now. Sir, the captain would like to invite you and your son to the cockpit after we land, if you're comfortable with that. He hesitated for a moment. He didn't want attention. He hadn't boarded the flight expecting this. But his son was staring at him, eyes shining. Can we? The boy whispered. The father looked at him, then back at the attendant. That will be fine, he said. She smiled in a way that felt genuine this time. We'll let you know when it's safe. As she walked away, a few nearby passengers leaned closer. The businessman extended his hand. I'm sorry if I seemed distant earlier. The father shook his hand firmly. It's a long flight. Everyone keeps to themselves. That call's sign, the man said carefully. I've heard of it. The father's expression stayed calm. It was a long time ago. But still, the businessman replied, not something people forget. The father didn't respond. He simply looked down at his son, who was now sitting a little taller in his seat. Dad, the boy said quietly, were you like the pilots? In a way, he answered. Did you fly fast jets? He smiled slightly. Sometimes. How fast? Very fast. The boy's jaw dropped in awe. Faster than his plane? He chuckled softly. Much faster. The conversation spread through the cabin in whispers. People pulled out their phones, not to record him, but to quietly search what that call sign might mean. A few faces changed as they read. The atmosphere was no longer about curiosity. It was about respect. Further back in the cabin, a middle-aged man stood up slowly. He wore a simple cap with a small patch stitched on the front. He walked carefully down the aisle toward row 12. When he reached the father, he stopped. He didn't speak at first. He simply straightened his posture and gave a firm, clean salute. The father looked up, surprised. For a second, the years seemed to disappear. The posture, the stillness, the silent understanding between two people who had once stood in similar places. The father stood halfway and returned the salute, not exaggerated, not dramatic, just correct. The man lowered his hand. "Good to see you still standing," he said quietly. "Good to be standing," the father replied. The man nodded once and returned to his seat without another word. The boy looked up again. "You have friends everywhere." The father smiled faintly. "Not everywhere." As the plane continued forward, something unexpected happened. The cabin crew began moving through the aisle again, but this time not with routine politeness. There was warmth in their voices, a different kind of care. One attendant stopped beside 12F again. "For your son," she said softly, handing him a small wing pin. From the crew. The boy's face lit up as if he had just received a treasure. "Thank you," he said loudly. The father felt his throat tighten. He remembered earning his own wings years ago. The weight of that moment, the responsibility that came with it. Seeing the small plastic pin in his son's hand felt strangely heavier. "You wear that proudly," he told the boy. "I will," the child replied seriously, clipping it onto his shirt. Passengers nearby smiled. The businessman leaned back in his seat, looking thoughtful now. "I almost upgraded to first class," he said quietly. "Funny how life works." The father glanced at him. "We're all headed to the same place." The man nodded slowly, as if that sentence carried more meaning than it first seemed. Up in the cockpit, the pilots were informed that the cabin had responded respectfully. No disruption, no chaos, just quiet honor. "That's good," the captain said. He knew they had taken a small risk by breaking routine. But some rules exist for safety, others exist for order, and sometimes respect stands above both. Back in 12F, the father finally allowed himself to breathe fully. He had worked hard to build a quiet life. He had stepped away from attention on purpose. For years, no one in grocery stores or school meetings had known who he used to be, and he preferred it that way. But something about today felt different. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about pride. It was about his son. The boy leaned closer again. "Why didn't you tell me before?" He thought carefully. "Because I didn't want that to be the only thing you saw when you looked at me." "What do you mean?" "I'm your dad first," he said gently. "Everything else comes after." The boy nodded slowly, as if trying to understand something bigger than his years. The seatbelt sign chimed on as the plane began its descent. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, this time back to standard updates about landing time and weather conditions. But there was a softness still present in his tone. The plane lowered through layers of clouds. The ground slowly came back into view. As wheels touched the runway, a small wave of relief passed through the cabin. When the aircraft rolled toward the gate, no one rushed to stand up this time. No one pushed forward impatiently. Instead, something rare happened. Passengers remained seated. The businessman turned to him. "You should go first." "That's not necessary," the father replied. "It is today," the man said firmly. Others nearby nodded. The flight attendant approached once more. If everyone could remain seated for just a moment, and they did. The father felt uncomfortable with the attention, but he understood what it meant. He unbuckled his son's seatbelt and stood carefully. The aisle cleared. As he stepped forward, people made eye contact with him, not in judgment now, but in gratitude. Some nodded, some whispered, "Thank you." A few simply placed their hands over their hearts. He responded the same way each time. A small nod, nothing more. When he reached the cockpit door, both pilots were standing there waiting. Up close, they looked younger than he expected, but their eyes carried the same understanding. The captain extended his hand. "It's an honor to have you on board." The father shook it firmly. "You did well up there." The first officer smiled. "We learn from the best." He shook his head slightly. "You learn from your training." They all knew what that meant. The boy stepped forward shyly. "You fly those fast jets?" he asked. The pilots chuckled. "Something like that," the captain replied. The first officer knelt slightly to the boy's level. "Your dad helped people like us once. That's why we saluted." The boy looked at his father differently now, not just as the man who packed lunches and fixed broken toys. But as someone who had once stood in the sky, the father placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "We all serve in different ways," he said quietly. The moment was simple. No cameras, no headlines, just people understanding each other. As they stepped off the plane into the terminal, the father felt something settle inside him. He had spent years being invisible by choice. Today, for a brief moment at 30,000 feet, he had been seen, not because of rank, not because of status, but because of respect earned long ago and carried quietly ever since. And as he walked to the airport with his son beside him, plastic wings pinned proudly to a small shirt, he realized something important. The salute had not changed who he was. It had simply reminded others to look twice before deciding who someone might be. The terminal felt different from the cabin. On the plane, everything had been contained in a narrow space, close and quiet. Here, the airport was wide, busy, full of movement again. Rolling suitcases clicked across the floor. Announcements echoed overhead. Strangers hurried past without knowing what just happened in the sky above them. To everyone else, it was just another flight that had landed on time. To the father and his son, it felt like something had shifted. They walked side by side through the terminal. The boy kept touching the small plastic wings pinned to his shirt, as if checking to make sure they were still there. "Dad," he said softly, "did they really mean it?" "Yes," the father replied. "All of it?" "Yes." The boy was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you ever tell me people would salute you?" He slowed his steps slightly. "Because I never needed you to salute me," he said gently. "I just needed you to know I love you." The boy looked down at the floor, thinking. Then he reached for his father's hand and held it tighter. They followed the signs toward baggage claim, even though they had only brought one small carry-on. The father liked to move with the flow of people. It felt less noticeable. But a few passengers from a flight spotted them again. The businessman approached, no longer rushed, no phone in his hand this time. "I hope you don't mind," he said, slightly out of breath. "I just wanted to say something before we go our separate ways." The father stopped politely. "Of course. I judged you when you sat down," the man admitted honestly. "I saw the jacket, the seat number. I assumed things." The father listened without interruption. "I was wrong," the man continued, "and I'm glad I was." The father gave a small smile. "We all assume sometimes." The man nodded. "Safe travels." "And thank you." He walked away, slower than before, as if carrying a new thought with him. The father watched him go, not with pride, but with understanding. People often saw what they expected to see: a worn jacket, an economy seat, a tired face. They rarely saw the years behind it. At the edge of the baggage area, another familiar figure approached, the middle-aged man who had saluted in the aisle. He extended his hand again. "Didn't expect to run into you like that," he said. "Neither did I," the father replied. "You heading to the gathering?" "Yes." The man nodded. "Good. It'll mean something to the younger ones." The father looked down at his son. "It already does." They shared a quiet moment of understanding. No long speeches, no dramatic words. Just two people who had walked similar paths. As the man left, the boy tugged at his father's sleeve again. "What gathering?" The father crouched slightly so they were eye level. "There's some old friends I haven't seen in a while," he explained. "People I used to work with. Like the pilots? Some of them. Are they going to salute you too?" He shook his head softly. "No, that's not how it works." "How does it work?" He thought carefully before answering. "It works by showing up," he said, "by remembering each other, by staying connected." The boy nodded slowly, trying to understand. They made their way outside the terminal, where the air felt warmer. The city skyline stood in the distance. Planes roared above as they took off one by one. The father paused for a second and looked up at the sky. For years, that sky had been his workplace, his responsibility, his test. Now, it was simply something beautiful to look at. "Do you miss it?" the boy asked suddenly, following his gaze. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Do you wish you were still flying?" He looked down at his son. "No," he said honestly. The boy seemed surprised. "Why not?" Because if I were still flying like that, I wouldn't be walking here with you right now. The boy smiled, satisfied with that answer. They reached the small shuttle that would take them toward the hotel near the base where the gathering was being held. It wasn't a fancy hotel, just practical. As they sat inside the shuttle, the father noticed his reflection in the window. The lines on his face were deeper than before. His hair showed more gray. His jacket still looked worn, but his eyes looked steady. He thought about the moment in the cabin when the captain had spoken. Some service doesn't come with medals you can see. That sentence stayed with him. Raising a child alone had required a different kind of strength. There were no formations, no structured briefings, no clear instructions. There were nights of fever and worry. School projects built at the last minute. Long shifts followed by early mornings. Quiet tears he never let his son see. And yet, those years had shaped him more than anything else. The shuttle stopped at a red light. A jet thundered overhead, climbing fast into the sky. The boy pressed his face against the glass. "Maybe one day I'll fly like that," he said. "Maybe you will," the father replied. "Would you be scared?" He smiled softly. "I'll always be a little scared." "Why?" "Because that's what love feels like sometimes." The boy thought about that quietly. When they reached the hotel, a small banner near the entrance welcomed former service members and their families. It wasn't flashy, just simple words printed on cloth. Inside, a few people were already gathered in the lobby. Conversation stopped briefly as they entered. Recognition spread slowly. Some faces lit up in surprise, others in quiet respect. A man approached with open arms. "Look at you," he said warmly. "Brought family this time." The father nodded. It was time. Introductions were made. Hands were shaken. Laughter broke out in small pockets of the room. The boy stayed close at first, slightly overwhelmed. But as stories began, carefully told, appropriate for young ears, he started to listen with wide eyes. He heard about teamwork, about discipline, about trust, not about danger or fear, but about responsibility and brotherhood. He looked at his father differently now, not as a hero in a loud, dramatic way, but as someone steady, someone who had made hard choices. Later that evening, after the conversation slowed and people drifted to their rooms, the father and his son stepped outside for some fresh air. The sky was dark now, stars faint but visible. "Dad," the boy said quietly, "I'm glad they saluted you." The father looked down at him. "I'm glad you were there to see it," he replied. They stood in silence for a moment. "Does it feel different now?" the boy asked. "A little," he admitted. "Better?" He considered that. "Not better," he said slowly. "Just clearer." "Clearer?" "Yes. Sometimes people need reminders to look beyond what they see first." The boy nodded. As they walked back inside, the father realized something important. The salute on the plane had not changed his life. It hadn't brought money. It hadn't erased struggle. But it had done something small and powerful. It had shown his son a piece of his story. And maybe, just maybe, it had reminded a few strangers to think twice before deciding who someone is based on a seat number or jacket. Later that night, in the quiet of the hotel room, his son fell asleep quickly, still wearing the plastic wings. The father sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the distant runway lights. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a father. And that was enough. In seat 12F, he had been ignored. In the sky, he had been saluted. But here, in the stillness of the night, what mattered most was simple. He had kept his promise. And tomorrow, he would keep doing the same thing he had done every day since walking away from the cockpit. He would show up for his son, for his future, quietly, without needing anyone to notice.